Chapter 24. The barn door was much easier to open now that she knew the secret. Carefully, Maggie drove the little Chevette out into the sunlight, threw it into park, and climbed out to close the door. Patty Ann had added a few items to her list: a decent outfit for the rehearsal and shoes that don't look like they're from the dollar store. Where she was going to find anything like that, she had no idea. Just as she made it back to her car, she heard the unmistakable rumble of the Dodge. Her gaze went to the trees. The pickup didn't break through, so she got in her car and drove up to them. At the trees, she stopped, noticing the pickup sitting in the garage parking place. The garage was opened, but no one was around. Next to the pickup sat the pewter Jaguar, and Maggie knew what that meant. She turned her gaze to the drive and purposely didn't look back. "Who's that?" Dallas asked as the Navy car went by the front window. Keith looked up from his sandwich, and his heart fell into his shoes. Probably Ike. He didn't want to think about who it really was. He didn't want to say her name or hear her voice or so much as see her face, even in his dreams, although it was there in every one. As much as that hurt, Maggie Montgomery was better off without Keith Ayer or anyone else in his disgustingly wretched family. They had wrecked her life, and now she was scraping by, trying to prove to them she deserved to work in their mansion. If life was fair, it would have been the other way around. Sunday morning, Keith had a plan. Dallas might never want to go with him, but that didn't mean he couldn't go. He got up early, showered, and dressed. He wasn't out to impress anybody, but he needed some sanity in his increasingly insane existence. Easing out of the house, lest he wake Dallas, Keith got into his pickup and made his way down the driveway and past the mansion. If he was lucky, Dallas would think he'd gone to work. Work. The word itself was kind of funny in a parallel universe kind of way. He showed up every day, fed the horses, fixed what needed fixed, but he wasn't really a part of it anymore. Hodges had wiggled and strong-armed his way back into the feed contract, and although Ike ranted and raved about it, Keith knew it was he that had signed the final order. The other side of work was the question of what he would do when all this was a memory. Dallas was pushing him to get a desk job. Mr. Henderson had offered him a job with his re-election campaign. His father's Galveston branch had called 3 days before, requesting an interview. However, nothing in Keith wanted anything to do with any of them. His heart said they were all wrong, and so he did nothing about them. The Dodge rounded the last corner in Pine Hill and slid up into a parking space outside the little church. This was it. If God couldn't help him make sense of this, no one could. Maggie's thoughts traveled down the little trail to the beautiful guest house beyond. Dallas was the luckiest girl in all of Texas, if not the world. To be 1 week away from being Keith's wife, it must be heaven on earth. "Kiki," Isabella said as she fell into Maggie's arms. "Oh, I love you, baby girl. You know that?" Maggie buried her face into the little curls, fighting not to cry. If it wasn't for the kids, she would have already turned in her resignation. This next week was sure to kill her. Watching them get married, a front row seat just in case she had any thoughts of skipping out. Why did Patty Ann and everyone else insist on smearing her face in the coming heartache? They, with their schedules and their seating charts and their reminders about how important this is to the Ayer family standing in the hierarchy of Texas and the nation. As if she needed any more pressure. "There's a hole in each and every one of us," the preacher said, as Keith sat in their normal spot, feeling the emptiness of the space around him. "A hole that only God can fill." He paused. "I picture this hole as a kind of vertical pipe that goes from our head to our heart and all the way through us. This hole is not something we created, but rather something God created in us. The purpose of life, the journey of life, is meant to show us that nothing other than God can ever successfully fill that hole. Not money, not things, not ourselves, not our work or our accomplishments, not our success or our awards. Nothing else can fill that hole. When we try to fill it with other things, we put them in the hole, but they slide right back out again, and we know we must fill it with something else. So we find another goal, another thing that's out there, and we think, yeah, that's it. If I can just get that, then I'll be happy. But it doesn't work that way, because stuff is not what will fill the hole. It is just as Jesus says to the Samaritan woman at the well, "He who drinks of this water will get thirsty again and again. But he who drinks from the water that I give will have a wellspring arising from his very being." Keith knew that hole very well. He'd stood at its mouth and shouted into it, hearing the echoes of his own loneliness come back at him. Others more so than him had tried to fill his hole with other things, activities, work, chores, games, and when he was older, he had tried to fill it himself with parties and alcohol and women. But the truth was, it was still empty. In fact, it was emptier now than it ever had been. So, how do you fill this hole, this vertical abyss that seems so unfathomably empty? You realize how inadequate you are to fill it on your own. Then you begin a quest to find the one who can. Jesus Christ came into our empty, wretched world to show us how to fill that hole. He came to show us how to be whole and how to be holy, filled and whole so that we are not condemned to live our lives scattered and empty. And how did Jesus say to fill the hole? By seeking to grow in love. Love of God, love of our neighbor, and love of ourselves. When we grow in love, when we honestly want what's best for the other, then and only then can that hole begin to be filled. So, we are called to go forth from this place and to seek God out in all situations, to bring His love to a fallen, dying world, to each of our worlds that need it so desperately. Find those who are hurting and show them God's love. Come to know His love. Breathe it into your being so that you may then breathe it out upon others. In doing so, your hole will be filled. Let us stand. Although he stood, Keith's mind was no longer on the service. It had traveled back in time to a day many years before, as he and his mother sat under a tree watching the falls cascade over the hard rock. "I thought Dad was going to come today," Keith said, his voice much higher pitched. His mother looked at him sadly. "He wanted to." "Then why didn't he?" "Because he's busy loving us." Her glance said she knew he didn't understand. "Your dad is a good dad, Keith. It's just that sometimes he gets what's important and what's urgent mixed up." She knew this lesson was going over his head, yet she continued. "We all do that sometimes. We let the urgent things, like meetings and making a living, crowd out the important things, like spending time together and loving each other. That doesn't make us bad, just confused." "But can't you explain it to him, make him understand?" She smiled. "I've tried, Keith. I really have. But sometimes you have to let people be on their own journey to find out what's important in their own time." "But what if he never figures it out?" In his memory, Keith could see her gaze fall, and he knew now she was struggling with that herself. Then her gaze met his. "We just have to pray that he does." The ride home was the shortest of Keith's life, and before he knew it, he was turning in to the estate. However, he couldn't go back just yet, so he turned down the stable road and drove until he came to the rocky pass that led out to the falls. He needed them right now, their peace, their hope. so he turned that direction. When he'd gotten close enough, he got out and walked the last 100 yards. There he sat down by the tree and let his gaze drift out over the falls. He was alone now, and for the first time in ages, he gave himself the permission to let everything he had bottled up inside himself out. Disbelief was the first thing to punch through the numbness he had clamped over everything else. God, why did you let this happen? I don't understand. There was so much hurt and anger unleashed by my dad's selfishness. He hurt Mom and me and everyone else who got in his path. Then a vague memory of a wreck he had never even seen drifted through him. He even ruined the lives of good people, people who loved you, people who trusted you. They didn't deserve to die like that. They were going to get their little girl sleeping at a friend's house. The words trailed away from him as anger and pain smashed into him. God, Maggie didn't deserve that. Why? Why did you let Dad live and take the other 3? They deserve to live so much more. Why would you choose to take them and leave him? Why? I don't understand. He sniffed and ran his wrist under his nose. It's not fair, you know. It's not. You should have taken him. He should burn in hell for all the grief he's caused. We have to pray that he figures it out, Keith. The words slid through him, but Keith fought them with a grip on both fists. I'm not praying for him. Find those who are hurting and show them God's love. His father's face, crumpled with hurt the last time Keith walked out of his office, traced through his consciousness. At that, he yanked himself to his feet. Looking out over the falls, he let the anger take over. You know what, God? He deserves to be hurting for all the heartache he's caused the rest of us. He deserves it. You hear me? And with that, he went back to the life that was laid out before him. Friday night, Keith didn't know how he and Dallas would ever make it to Sunday in one piece. She was a basket case, and he wasn't much better. Her flowing white sheath dress hung perfectly around her lithe body, but she wasn't at all pleased with the fit. She stood in the bedroom at the mirror, yanking and pulling and readjusting, all the while muttering to herself, "Do you think we should show up together or separate?" "Why wouldn't we go together?" Keith asked from where he was shaving in the bathroom. The razor took an unscheduled zag, which left blood trailing behind it. Crud. "What's wrong?" "I just cut myself." He examined the blood in the mirror. Great, as if I needed one more thing to go wrong today. "I knew I should have had the seamstress take these shoulders up. I look like a bag lady." Dallas appeared at the bathroom door, looking anything but a bag lady. Keith glanced over at her, trying to get gratefulness for his position in life to come over him. "You look beautiful." She twisted her mouth. "You have to say that." "Would you rather I said you looked hideously awful?" She smiled slightly. "At least you'd be honest." Tenderness for how vulnerable she sounded went through him. Knowing they would only make it through this together, he turned and took her in his arms, oblivious to the remaining streaks of shaving cream still on his face. "You will have every guy jealous of me all night." "Are you sure?" Her gaze spoke of genuine concern. "Positive." The shoes hurt, but Maggie couldn't worry about that. Too many other issues were more important, like the fact that Izzy's bow wouldn't stay in her hair, and Peter kept fidgeting with his tie. Her nerves hit the overload button when the limo rolled to the front of the Silver Rose. This place wasn't just fancy, it was lavish. "Ma'am?" the gentleman outside the restaurant said, offering her his hand. Maggie let him help her out, hoping she didn't look so out of place that he would notice. The once-over his gaze did down her dress didn't help. Was it that bad? She helped the kids out and marched them up the stairs. Choreographed to the second, the Ayers limo pulled up just as she and the children got to the top step. With everything in her, she wished she could reach down and fix her shoe, but she smiled like everything in life was wonderful as they waited for the Ayers to climb the steps and walk first into the restaurant. The rehearsal at the mansion had been blessedly short, but this fiasco of a night threatened to be the longest of her life. Inside the restaurant, Maggie found a quiet corner for her and the kids. She sat Izzy on her lap and put an arm around Peter.
"Why can't we just go home?" Peter whined. "I don't want to be here."
"Shh." Maggie leaned down to him. "I know, but Keith's coming. You want to see him, right?" She was at the end of her rope and fully intended on using every trick she knew, even those that might take her out permanently. "Oh, don't you kids look so precious?" Jamie walked up, and Isabella squealed her delight. "Come here, you." It took just that long for Jamie to be holding the little girl. Tanner walked up behind Jamie, and he smiled at Maggie. "You made it, huh?" He extended his hand. Maggie took it and stood. "Barely." Greg stepped up to the little group. "Well, fancy meeting you all here." Illogically, he put his hand on Maggie's back, and trying to think of some way to steer the conversation so Tanner and Jamie wouldn't notice, she glanced around the room. They sure do things up right, don't they? "You can say that again." Tanner pulled at the tie at his neck, and Maggie had to keep herself from laughing because he looked just like Peter. "If I'd have known about all of this when Keith asked me, I'd have told him no way." "That makes two of us," Greg said. They all laughed as Tanner's gaze slid past her. "Well, speak of the devil." Without thinking, Maggie turned, and her heart lurched forward with a falling thud. White shirt, smoke-colored pants, no hat or bandana. Keith Ayer had arrived. "They make such a good couple," Jamie breathed behind Maggie, and it hurt to agree. Why it was so hard to play along, Keith would never be able to figure out, but he was exhausted from the effort. By the time dessert was over, his nerves were frayed to the point of snapping. All night the angel in the soft blue dress had played tag with his gaze. He was glad that Greg, Tanner, and Jamie seemed to be keeping her company and helping with the kids, but it was all he could do not to trash everything and join them. Twice he almost had. Once, when his father cornered him with a 60-second lecture on how he had to smooth things over with Mr. Henderson or else, and once when he saw Greg lean in so close to her that they might as well have been swapping air. Finally, Vivian announced to all that they had better get home so they could check on the final preparations. With his arm around Dallas, Keith watched Maggie make her way to the door. Isabella was asleep on her shoulder, and Peter was cradled in Greg's arm. It killed Keith not to go ask what their plans were. Was Greg going home with her too? Would they put the kids to bed and then pray over them? "We're staying at the Crown Plaza tomorrow night," Dallas said to the two bridesmaids that Keith didn't know all that well. From what he could tell, they were the Giggle Brigade. "Keith wanted our night to be special." Dallas's gaze slid over his face. "I'm the luckiest girl in the world." When he looked back at the door, Maggie was gone. The whole night Maggie had been dropping hints for Greg to leave her alone, but still he was there. When they made it back to the mansion, he was right there to help her from the limo. He, of course, had driven his own car, insisting that he wanted to see her home even if they couldn't ride together. "Here, I'll get him." Greg took Peter from Maggie, and Maggie gathered up Isabella. Up first one set of steps, and then the others inside, Greg followed her. "This place always amazes me. It's like a museum with all the statues and stuff." "Yeah," Maggie agreed. There was a blister on her heel that was taking up all the brain power she had left. She took Isabella and changed her, then put her to bed. Then she joined Greg in Peter's room to get Peter ready for bed. She felt Greg watching her as she worked, and it unnerved her. Her hands were shaking with the stress of the day and the trepidation of now. In minutes, Peter was sound asleep in bed. She kissed her fingers, said a soft prayer, and then pressed her fingers to Peter's forehead. Good night, little prince." With that, she turned and Greg followed her out. "These heels are killing me." She removed one, then the other. The process left her much shorter than she had ever seemed next to him. She glanced back at him. "You know, Greg, I'm really tired. You're so good with them." He sounded as if he wasn't really there. "I guess I've never really been around kids much before. They always kind of scared me." "They're kids. What's so scary about them?" Kids were a snap compared with this. She wanted him to leave so she could go to bed, but he didn't leave. Instead, he stood there looking at her. "Look, Maggie, I know I messed up and I'm really sorry. Please give me another chance." His gaze was drilling through her, although her head was down. "Please." It took all the courage she had, but Maggie dragged her gaze up to his. "Greg, I like you. I really do. Just not like that." His gaze dropped from hers to the carpet. "It's not fair for me to let you think there's something there when there's not." She tried to look at him, but he wouldn't look up. "I'm really sorry." Finally, he nodded, and then he looked up with a tight smile. "Will you go with me to the wedding tomorrow?" "Greg." "No, not like that. Just as friends. Please?" It took a breath, but finally she nodded. "I can't believe Greg and Ike didn't take you out tonight," Dallas said as their limo rolled up to the guest house. "I figured they'd abscond with you at the first break in the action." Considering that Ike wasn't talking to him these days, and that Greg had left with a woman he really loved, Keith was kind of glad they didn't. "Yeah, well, it's okay." "You know, I didn't pack all of my surprises for the honeymoon. Maybe I could get one out tonight for a little preview." The thought made him want to throw up. He forced the air out of his lungs slowly. "I'm really beat, Dallas. Why don't you save it for tomorrow night when we're official?" Official. The word sounded so very final. She wrapped her arms around him like an anaconda. "Okay, but you don't know what you're missing." The sun would be up in an hour, but Keith couldn't sleep. By this time tomorrow morning, Dallas Henderson would be his wife, and there would be no going back. He sat in the recliner, letting scenes from his life flash before him. There were the turns he had taken and the ones that had been taken for him. There were decisions he made, but more that had been made for him. Although it knifed him to the core to think it, he knew that this marriage was the best thing for everyone save himself. It would make his father happy, finally. It would make Mr. and Mrs. Henderson happy, although why that was he wasn't really sure. It would make Dallas happy. But the one that kept him moving forward was the knowledge that if he just married Dallas, Maggie would be free to go on with her life. Sooner or later, she would certainly leave the mansion, and the Ayer family, replete with all their curses and selfishness, would be forever out of her life. She deserved that much. Of that, and only that, Keith was perfectly sure. Chapter 25. "We need the children for the pictures," Patty Ann said, appearing at the door of Isabella's room. It was only 1:00. The wedding wouldn't start for 4 more hours. Whose brilliant idea it was to start with the children's pictures, Maggie wasn't at all sure, but whoever it was had no concept of how restless children got in dress clothes. "Mr. Ayer requested that they be brought to the waterfall for the pictures." The waterfall? Maggie's heart sank through the thought. "Why can't we just do it here?" Patty Ann's face fell into a scowl. "Really, Miss Montgomery, you're not going to wear tennis shoes with that dress now, are you?" Maggie looked down at her shoes beneath the soft satin of her formal peach dress. It was $25 at the thrift store, and it only had one small hole in the back hem. Not for the wedding, just for the keeping up with the kids for pictures and stuff. I got a horrendous blister from last night." The secretary didn't look at all pleased. "Well, don't let anyone important see you in those things. We'll both be fired on the spot." She started to turn. "Oh, and Tanner is downstairs to take you to the falls. The wedding party is meeting down there." "Okay." Maggie swept Isabella off the carpet and grabbed Peter's hand. At least Tanner would be there to keep her company. He and Jamie had been so nice the night before. They were a diversion, a distraction to keep her mind from thinking too far into the future or too much about the present. "Hi," she said at the bottom of the steps.
"Oh, look at you. You're so precious."
Jamie squealed when she saw Isabella, and Isabella squealed back.
"And Peter, aren't we handsome today?"
Peter smiled proudly. "Well, let's just hope we are still precious and handsome 4 hours from now," Maggie said with a laugh. The others would be descending on the place in no time. Keith knew that, so for one last moment, he stood at the edge of the falls and enjoyed the peacefulness. The wedding was edging inexorably closer, but standing here, he could pretend that he was again 10 years old, with his mother and her wisdom. "Mom, you know I only want what's best for everyone," he whispered, "even if it's not what I want." The breeze whispered back to him, and then another sound hummed through that one. Keith turned, and his heart flipped over. Tanner's pickup parked next to the Dodge. Keith himself had sent Tanner on that errand, and so he knew better than anyone what his arrival meant. A door, another, and wedding-attired people tumbled out. Tanner held Peter, and Jamie held Isabella. Then, behind them, Keith caught sight of the only one he'd been wanting to see since she'd walked out the night before. "Looks like we even beat the photographer," Tanner said as he carefully descended the rocky path that was more fit for cowboy boots than a tuxedo. "Hey, Mr. Ayer, sorry to keep you waiting." Keith's gaze never left her as she picked her way down the path. "Don't worry about it. I'm just glad you made it." With the way her luck was going, Maggie knew she would probably twist an ankle on the hard rocks and go crashing to the ground in a heap of peach and blood. It took only one glance at Keith to confirm how dangerous to her heart this situation really was. His white tuxedo set off the deep tan of his face, and the dark hair that always made her ultra-aware that he wasn't just the estate handyman. "I thought the photographer was supposed to be here," Jamie said. "Ike went to get him," Keith said, looking only at Maggie, and her nerves twisted over themselves. "Where's Greg?" Tanner asked. "Getting Dallas and the other bridesmaids." Keith looked at his watch. "They should all be here any minute."
"Keith!"
Isabella squealed, tossing her arms out for him. He took her with a smile that ripped Maggie apart. She let her gaze drift out to the falls. It had always been so easy to be here with him, so deceptively easy. "Hey there, little one. You look like a little princess." Keith turned for the tree, and the others followed him. "Come on, let's get you out of the sun." The heavens had had mercy on them. The weather was a cool 89 degrees, and for June that was better than anyone could have hoped. "This is so gorgeous," Jamie said. "I had no idea this was here." Keith glanced at her. "Thanks." They reached the tree, and Keith put Isabella on the blanket he had already laid out. "Why don't you show her around, Tanner? There's some really nice views right over there." Tanner nodded, and he and Jamie walked off hand in hand. "They're a cute couple," Maggie said, trying desperately to ward off any serious conversation. He was so heart-stoppingly handsome today, she might well say something she would have to feel guilty for saying forever. Peter sat down next to Izzy and started playing. The breeze caught a strand and sent it skittering across Maggie's face. She brushed it away, feeling Keith's gaze slide to her. Thinking she could just smile at him, she glanced his direction. But the intensity in his eyes jerked everything but her racing heart to a screeching halt. "I'm sorry," he said softly. His eyes held a tender apology. Concern slipped through her. Sorry, for what? His gaze fell and then drifted back up to hers. For how my family's treated you, for all the junk they've put you through. She smiled and brushed the thought away. It's no big deal. The tenderness left. No, it is a big deal, to me. Her ears picked up the sound of a vehicle, but she couldn't look away from him. He wouldn't let her. If I could make it all better, I would, he said, holding her gaze in a grip so tight she couldn't breathe. The tree formed a barrier between them and whoever had gotten out of the vehicle up the path. You deserve so much better. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you don't. She wanted him to stop talking like this, like he was at somebody's funeral or something. Keith? No, Maggie. He reached out and took her hand. The warmth of his hand, coupled with the gentleness of his touch, sent tingles throughout her entire body. I just want you to be happy. I just want what's best for you, no matter what that means. For the barest of moments, Maggie was swept up in the completely illogical thought that he was about to kiss her. Then, as quickly as the moment was there, it was gone. We made it, Ike said, stepping around the tree with an armload of camera equipment. Maggie's hand dropped back to her side, and she half turned, some to get away from Keith, some to make sure Ike knew she was. She reached up and pushed the hair from her eyes, hoping the heat in her face wasn't evident to anyone other than her. However, Ike took one look at them, and his smile fell into a frown. There's more equipment in the truck. Why don't you go help him get it down here? Oh, okay, yeah, Keith said, and he walked around the tree away from her. Maggie felt every step he took. Boy, you are some piece of something, Ike said, eyeing her from head to toe. They're getting married today. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Words were smashing into one another in her head. You're here to watch the kids, Ike said with so much ice Maggie almost shivered. Don't forget it. I think we'll start right over here, the photographer said, lugging a camera and a tripod past the tree. Will the bride be here soon? She's on her way, Keith said, following him as if he had never so much as heard there was a tree by the falls. They went down to the rock shelf as Maggie fought to breathe. How she had gotten tagged enemy number 1 by Ike, she had no idea, but it was clear she had better steer clear or risk being roasted for dinner. At that moment, Keith's gaze snagged hers from where he stood with the photographer at the falls, and he smiled a sad half-smile at her. Maggie yanked her gaze from his. Behind her, the roar of another approaching vehicle slid through the stillness. She whipped her head to the side to see who it was. From one door stepped Greg. From the back stepped 3 bridesmaids in celery green taffeta, and then, from the other side stepped the real love of Keith's life. A goddess in the most beautiful dress ever created, and Maggie knew her heart would never be the same again. Taking pictures was an ordeal. Had he known it would be this bad, Keith never would have suggested it. Dallas was in top form. She was either yelling at him or kissing him, and he couldn't decide which was worse. Throughout the nightmare of an hour of posing, first here and then there, he kept tabs on Maggie, and nothing in him liked the droop of her shoulders or the downcast of her eyes. She looked sadder than he had ever seen her, and he wondered if his bungling of the apology from before was what had upset her. He hadn't meant to upset her, but trying to dance around the phrase, "I love you," was harder than he'd ever expected it to be. "Oh, joy," Tracy said as they stood waiting for the photographer to set the next shot of the entire wedding party, sans ring bearer and flower girl. "Greg, did you have to invite the dollar store queen? I mean, look at that dress. She probably fished it out of a dumpster somewhere." Keith's heart slid through him at the luridly mean tone in Tracy's voice. Maggie Montgomery was 10 times the woman Tracy would ever be, and yet beside him, Dallas laughed as if it was funny. "She's the help," Dallas said spitefully. "You know Greg just can't help himself." Greg stood next to Keith, and his tone was low and bitter. "You know, you two could be just a little more mean, and maybe Satan would draft you for another tour in hell." Dallas laughed at him. "Oh, come on, Greg. We're joking. You know that." "Ha ha," he said, but he wasn't laughing, and neither was Keith. "Okay, everyone look here and smile." It was asking a lot. "We've got more pictures to take at the mansion," Dallas instructed as the group made their way up the rocks, "so don't anyone get lost on the way back." Lost sounded very good to Maggie. If she'd had her way, she would have gone the long route home, preferably through China. Carrying Isabella, she climbed up and up and up until she wouldn't have been surprised to have found herself in heaven at the top of the path. "We should have all been smart and worn shoes like Maggie," Tracy said, and it was obvious it wasn't a compliment. "Shut up, Tracy," Greg warned from his place just behind her. "What? I didn't know we were going hiking." Maggie pushed the words and the hurt from her. Just get through this. Just keep moving and get through it. At the top, she put the kids in Tanner's truck without so much as looking at anyone. She was out of place here. They all knew it, and so did she. "Maggie, Keith's taking Dallas back," Greg said, appearing at the door to Tanner's pickup. "You want to ride with me?" Oh. She glanced at Tracy, who was slinging arrows at her with her gaze just behind Greg. No. I think I'll just ride with the kids." "Are you sure?" Greg slid his hand over hers, which immediately pulled up memories of the last guy to hold her hand like that. Tears of helplessness stung her eyes as her heart turned over. She couldn't find a safe place to look. At the Dodge, Keith turned and smiled softly at her. Then with a glance back to the falls, he got into the pickup and drove off with Dallas in the passenger's seat. Maggie's gaze plummeted to the ground. "Yeah, I'm sure." Pictures of the wedding party at the mansion had given way to pictures of just Keith and Dallas, and from Isabella's room above the festivities, Maggie watched them below, holding hands, smiling at each other, and kissing. Every look, every kiss broke her heart into a few more pieces. She wrenched her arms over themselves to keep the pain away, but still it attacked her like warriors breaching barricades. He was getting married. Keith was getting married. This was real. It wasn't just some nightmare that she would wake up from. It was really happening. Tears slid out of her eyes as she watched them, so happy, so right together. Keith's arms were around Dallas, just as Maggie had wished for so long they would be around her. Dallas gazed up at him, and the look he gave her in return could hold no other meaning. Watching it was horrible. It was like being ripped apart from the inside out. The soft knock on the door smashed through her, and she swiped at the tears as she turned. "Yeah?" "Maggie?" Jamie asked in instant concern when she saw her. "Maggie, what's wrong?" Anguish crashed through the pain. I can't do this." Jamie's concern deepened. "Can't do what?" Maggie raked her fingers through her hair. "I can't stay here. I've got to go." "Go? But—" An escape plan formed in her head as Maggie looked at the young lady. "You have to cover for me, Jamie. You're good with the kids. They'll be all right with you." "Me? Maggie, what are you talking about?" "Tell them I got a call from home. Tell them it was an emergency and I had to go. Tell them I'm sorry." She stepped past Jamie and ran to her room, tears blinding her path. Nothing other than the overwhelming desire to run was getting through. If she could just leave, just get out of here before anyone knew she was gone, then surely her heart wouldn't crack in two. As she dragged her suitcase from the closet, she heard the first strains of the violins downstairs. Guests were already arriving. She didn't have much time to make her getaway. In fistfuls, she yanked her clothes from the closet and threw them into the suitcase just as the door to her room came open. "Maggie, what are you doing?" Greg asked in horror. "Where are you going?" "Back where I belong." "Well, I guess you got what you wanted," Tanner said to Ike as Keith readjusted his tie at the mirror of the bedroom where they were getting ready. "Ms. Montgomery's leaving." In 1 second, the tie was forgotten as Keith spun. "Leaving?" Tanner nodded. "Jamie just came and got Greg. She said Ms. Montgomery's real upset. She's packing to leave." "What? No, she can't." Keith was at the door in 2 steps, but before he could get through it, Ike stepped between him and his destination. "Let her go, Keith. She's no better than the rest of them." "The rest of?" Keith wasn't comprehending. "Get out of my way, Ike." But the old cowboy didn't budge, and with his foot anchored there, neither did the door. Anger snapped into Keith. "Move, or I'll move you." Ike stood for one more long moment, and then, with a slow shake of his head, he stepped to the side. Keith yanked the door open and raced into the hallway, through the upstairs, and right to the kids' wing. At Maggie's door, Greg stood pleading with her to stop. "You don't have to do this, Maggie. Really, it's not—" Keith pushed past Greg, and the sight of Maggie standing at the bed, her back to the door, latching the suitcase, slammed into him. "Maggie, what are you doing?" In a breath, she whirled around. The look in her eyes was hard and determined. "I know I should stay for the kids' sake, but I just can't, okay? Don't ask me why. I've just—" She reached back and swung the suitcase to her. "I've got to go." "Maggie, wait." As she brushed past him, Keith snagged her wrist, and she stopped 1 inch from him. His gaze slid down her face to her lips, and then traced back up again. "Please, don't go. I don't want you to go." She slammed her eyes closed, and he knew she was fighting as hard as he was. "I hope you and Dallas will be very happy together." With that, she opened her eyes, and the look in them ripped his own helplessness wide open. 1 shake of her wrist, and she was free of him. "I've got to go." Knocking into everyone she met on the way out, Maggie headed for the stairs. "It's time, everyone," Patty Ann said, climbing the stairs and meeting Maggie coming the other way down them. "Ms. Montgomery, where are you going?" But Maggie never stopped. Keith followed her out of the room and stood with a whole audience behind him as he watched her go. He wanted to go after her, to stop her and tell her that he loved her, but the truth was, he loved her too much to do that. She was better off without him. "Would someone please tell me what's going on?" Patty Ann asked, her face livid. "Greg." Keith turned to his best friend. He didn't even have to say the words. The look of sheer panic conveyed the message perfectly. "Yeah, I'll go." Greg started down the stairs after Maggie, but Patty Ann stopped him. "You're the best man. You can't leave." "Oh yeah? Watch me." Glad for the tennis shoes, Maggie ran, stumbling down the trail to the guest house. The suitcase banged into her leg, nearly tripping her, but she didn't care. She had to get away. Knowing that the barn must be at an angle to her present location, she ducked into the trees and cut cross country. "God, please, please just get me out of here." "The final guests have been seated," Patty Ann exclaimed in horror as she climbed the main staircase into the emotional chaos above. "Your parents are walking down the aisle right now. You're supposed to be downstairs ready to go. What are you all doing, standing around for? We've got a wedding to put on." The others seemed to scatter to their rightful posts, but Keith couldn't move. He stood there at the balcony railing, gazing down into nothing. He couldn't move, not a finger, not a toe. If Greg didn't find her, she might be gone forever. It was what he said he wanted for her, but watching it happen was killing him. "Mr. Ayer," Patty Ann said, reappearing at the bottom of the steps. "Now!" In her headlong dash to leave, Maggie had almost forgotten the secret of getting the barn door open. Finally, with a bang of her body into it, the bolt came free, and the door swung open. Motion after motion she made until she and the suitcase were in the car and it was running. She spun out of the barn and urged the little car up the path to the trees. Details like closing the barn door were lost in the haze of numbness. She drove past the garage without looking at it and turned on the pavement. In less than a minute she was at the mansion, and in less than another she was out the front gate. Swiping at the tears, she forced herself not to think about what time it was, about what was happening, about life itself. Where she was going, she had no idea. Anywhere had to be better than here. 600 pairs of eyes gazed at Keith as he walked out of the side room and took his place at the front of the assembled guests. He wasn't really breathing or thinking. It was more momentum carrying him forward than anything. Right up front, his father smiled at him and nodded. There was something so spirit-sapping about that look, Keith had to look away. Yes, his father was proud of him, because this wasn't him. It was some made-up plastic replica of him that clinched him in its vice grip. Finally, you are rising to the occasion, his father's look seemed to say. Keith shook his head and replanted his gaze to the aisle beyond. Dallas, basking in the glow of having all eyes on her, walked gracefully beside her father. Mr. Henderson, too, was milking this walk for all it was worth. Flashbulbs went off ahead of them, and disgust clenched Keith's gut. In minutes, he would be tied to that farce of a delusional display. It wasn't real. None of it. "Do you want to be rich or to look rich?" Maggie's voice asked from deep inside him. Looking at them, Keith couldn't help but think how rich they looked, but how terribly poor in morals and judgment and the things that really counted that they were. When they made it to the end of the aisle, Mr. Henderson turned and kissed Dallas. Then he looked at Keith with a gaze that would have melted Everest. "Be good to her, you hear me?" Keith swallowed and nodded. When Mr. Henderson stepped to the side, Keith offered her his arm. He wasn't going to make the mistake of taking her hand like he had at the rehearsal the night before. If he had learned anything, it was that this was important, and every detail had to be right. "No!" Maggie wailed as the hissing sound increased, sending the power in her car into a death spiral. When it rolled to a stop on the side of the road leading out of Pine Hill, she allowed herself to sit and wallow in her pathetic bad luck for one moment before she slammed her shoulder into the door to get it to open. At the front of the car, she reached down to pop the hood, nearly scalding her hand in the process. When the hood was open, she waved the steam away. "I cannot believe this. What else could go wrong?" Just then, she heard the sound of a vehicle coming up behind her, and she turned and shielded her eyes from the late afternoon sun. Maybe if she was lucky, she could get a ride to a bus station. Del Rio sounded really nice right about now. However, when she got a good look at the stopping car, annoyance jammed into her. In seconds, it was stopped, and the driver was out and striding toward her. In just as many, she was buried in his arms. "Maggie," Greg said. "Oh, thank God you're okay." Chapter 26. Do you, Keith Warren Ayer, take Dallas Celeste Henderson to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, till death do you part? The words seemed so simple, 2 of them, 2 little syllables, in fact. But the questions and concerns smashing into each other in the middle of his gut wouldn't let them find the air. The minister cleared his throat. Mr. Ayer?" "Huh?" Keith asked, looking up at him as if he had no idea why he was standing there. "Do you take Dallas to be your wife?" Keith's gaze slid to her, and one question trumped all the others. He glanced at the preacher and then at her. Finally, his gaze settled on the preacher. Hold that thought. "I can call a tow truck," Greg said as they stood beside the road, examining the heap that used to be a car. "I'm sorry." Maggie glanced at him. "You were supposed to be at the wedding. I didn't mean to drag you into this." "Hey, don't sweat it. I'd rather be out here with you than at some pretentious showboat wedding anyway." He smiled at her. "Come on, let's get out of here." "I'll call a tow truck to come get this. We can go back to my place." Panic seized her, but he just smiled. "Don't worry, I'll behave myself."
"Keith, what do you think you're doing?" Dallas asked in a barely contained screech as he dragged her from the garden into the little side room.
Once there, she yanked her wrist free of his grip.
"This is not funny."
"I'm not laughing." He turned to her and put both hands on her arms, which were bare owing to the strapless wedding gown. "Listen, I have to know something." Her eyes were wild with frustration.
"What? That you're insane?"
"No." Sirius snapped through him. "Listen to me, Dallas. I have to know something before we do this."
"What? What in the world is so important that you humiliate me in front of 600 people?"
Keith took a breath to settle the question in his heart. "Do you believe in God?"
At that, even her anger fell into incomprehension. "What? What kind of a question is that?"
"I have to know. It's important to me."
Dallas took that in, closed her eyes, and shook her head. "Keith, this is crazy. What difference does it make if I believe in God or not?"
"Just a simple yes or no, Dallas. That's all I need." She thought a little longer.
"Well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, what's not to believe?"
The answer wasn't really an answer, more of a question. "Do you have faith that he'll get you through this life? I mean, does he factor into your decisions at all?" Her gaze turned decidedly skeptical.
"God?"
His spirit was falling through her apathy toward the topic. "Yeah, is he a real part of your life?"
I don't know. What do you want me to say?"
"The truth, Dallas. I want the truth." The door swung open.
"What's going on in here?"
his father hissed. "Please, Dad, we're in the middle of something."
"Yeah? Does the word wedding come to mind?" his father asked.
"Please, Dad, just give us a minute."
"You don't have a minute, Keith. You are embarrassing me in front of half the state of Texas. Now get out here."
"Is everything all right?" Vivian asked from outside. His father ducked out.
"Fine, Viv. Go sit down."
Then, just before his father could rip into him again, Dallas turned knowing eyes on him.
"This is about her, isn't it?"
"Her? What her?" his father asked, coming back in.
"This is about that little tramp, that what's-her-name, Maggie."
The name dripped like poison.
"Montgomery?"
his father asked as his eyes widened and too many pieces to count dropped into place behind them. Keith let his hands drop. It really wasn't about Maggie, but he would never be able to convince them of that. He sat back on something he couldn't have named had he tried. "No, Dallas, this is not about Maggie. It's about we're not right for each other, and we never have been. We want different things from life. You want the money and the stuff that comes from being an Ayer, and I," he glanced at his father, "wish I had never been born an Ayer."
"Keith Warren Ayer, don't you even talk like that. You are privileged to be a part of this family."
His father nearly yelled, only stopping himself because of the 1,000 ears outside, no doubt listening for any sign of what was going on.
"It's a wonder I haven't thrown you out before now."
"Why, Dad? Because I wasn't good enough for you?" Keith dragged his gaze up to his father's, and hate and loathing were all he saw there. "Well, you know what? That's pretty remarkable coming from somebody who killed 3 people and walked away like it never happened." The punch landed hard and true. The condescension in his father's eyes fell away. "What? How? What? You didn't think I'd ever find out?" Keith asked. A haze of numbness, so that he couldn't really feel anything, fell over him. "And I'm sure you threatened the others so they wouldn't tell me, or did you just pay them off to keep them quiet?" His gaze came up and found Ike standing just behind his father. The older cowboy couldn't meet his gaze, and he looked like he'd rather run than be there at that moment. "Yeah, well, you almost covered your tracks good enough." His gaze dropped from Ike to his father. "Almost." "Keith," his father started. Keith pulled himself to his feet and stepped over to Dallas. When his gaze came up, it was with true regret. "I'm really sorry you got mixed up in all of this, but us getting married isn't right, and it's a lie I'm not willing to try to live." He started to step past her. "Keith, wait," Dallas said, her dress whooshing as she turned. "Can't we get married now, just so these people won't know? We can always go down to City Hall and get a divorce tomorrow." It was so hard to believe he'd almost forced himself to say "I do" to her. "No, Dallas, lying's not my style." With that, he turned instead to the inside door. A twist of the knob, and he walked away from the whole ugly horde of them forever. "Can I get you something?" Greg asked as Maggie sat on his couch, trying to get everything that had just happened to line up in her head. "No, thanks." "I've got Sprite," he said, a teasing quality edging the statement. She smiled up at him sadly and shook her head. Greg stood there looking down at her for the longest time. Then he spun and sat on the couch, a full cushion away. "Okay, here's what I don't understand. Why didn't you just go for it with Keith? Dallas wasn't here. No one would ever have known." Maggie shook her head. The dreams she hadn't let herself acknowledge were there flowed through her even now. "Keith isn't like that." Greg turned to her. "That's just it. Keith is like that, or at least he was. All through high school and college, even after he met Dallas. Women were never an issue for him. He'd take what he wanted and never look back." Again, Maggie shook her head. "That's not the Keith I know. He's sweet and kind, and he cares about people, not just on the outside, but about how they really are in here." She put her hand to her heart and then let it slide up her neck. "At least, that's who I thought he was." With a twist, Greg took his jacket off and laid it on the couch arm, smoothing the fabric with his hand. However, halfway down it he stopped. "What?" she asked, seeing his hesitation. Slowly Greg reached into the folds and pulled out a little box. Something tells me they'll be wondering where these are." At that moment, Greg's cell phone on the counter beeped, and both gazes went to it. He stood, went to it, and answered it. "Hello? Oh, hi." His gaze traced to hers, and Maggie caught the implication. Panic surged through her as she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "Don't tell them I'm here." Greg turned to the phone call. "No, man, I looked. I don't know where she went." Keith considered leaving the guest house. Dallas already had amidst a hail of curses from both her and her parents. He stood there, absorbing them all as they gathered her things and left. They were right. He was good for nothing. He had led her on in hopes of making everyone believe he was something he was not. And he had let her down in the worst way imaginable. The only thing that could conceivably have been worse would have been if he had actually married her. When they were gone, he sat down in the chair and pulled the Bible from the little compartment. Something about the fact that it didn't have to be hidden anymore lifted his spirit from the muck ever so slightly. He let it fall open to no particular page. At 2 Peter, he started reading. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. Keith groaned with the reading and let his head fall back on the recliner. God, how could you be patient with me? Me, of all people. I've done such horrible things. I was so hurt, I didn't care who got hurt because of me. The pain of a life poorly lived knifed through him. Why don't you just put me out of my misery and get it over with? His hand slid the pages to the side as the anguish gushed over him. I'm not worthy of you, Lord. Can't you see that? His gaze fell to the words, even as tears blinded them from his sight. Because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. Keith breathed in those words, read them again, and breathed some more. It was like inhaling God for the first time. I don't understand, God. I don't understand why you won't just let me drop. That's what I deserve. Again, his hands worked the pages, and his gaze fell to the words there. Where can I go from thy spirit, or where can I flee from thy presence? If I ascend to heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, thou art there. He didn't know where Sheol was, but he had a sneaking suspicion that God had been there and every other place Keith had ever been. God, for some inexplicable reason, seemed to be dogging his every step. Exhaustion was beginning to take over, but he let his fingers trace through the pages one last time. The red attracted his gaze. If any man is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture said, from his innermost being shall flow rivers of living water. Living water. What had the preacher said about filling that place, that hole, with anything other than God? That's what Keith felt like he'd been doing for all of 30 years. Filling and filling and filling, and always finding the hole empty. First, it was spending his father's money. Cars, women, wine. The world made it look so easy. Yet at the end of the day, at the end of every party, when he woke up in the morning in someone else's bed, the emptiness was always right there with him. It was just like that verse said, where can I run from it? It followed him. No, it didn't just follow him. It was a part of him. No, not even just that. It was him. He was the empty hole, waiting, hoping, wishing, pleading for something or someone to fill it. And still, it was empty until a young lady with funny glasses and shoes 2 sizes too big had stumbled into his life. He closed the Bible and ran his hand over it. The others had all given him themselves, for an hour, for a night. But she had given him something better, something he had been searching for his whole life. She had given him the answer to filling the hole. As if compelled by some force he didn't recognize, Keith got up and went to the phone. He dialed information, and in minutes he had the number for Del Rio. Home. Yes, Maggie would have gone home. The shower had felt good. It calmed her and warmed her. At least it had tried. True to his word, Greg had been nothing but kind. She knew he was still trying to sort everything out, but then again, so was she. Her hair still dripping, she walked into the living room, toweling it dry. Greg was sitting on the couch. He only glanced up when she entered. Keith called again. He's really worried about you. Huh. I can't believe he's not halfway to Hawaii by now. The deep concern of the brown eyes gathered her in. They didn't go through with it. The towel dropped 3 inches.
What? Why not?
Greg smiled. Same reason you took off. Keith's a basket case with worry. His gaze questioned her. Do you love him? There was no real way around the truth.
Yeah, but it would never work between us.
Why not? He loves you, you love him.
Because, Greg, he's Keith Ayer. He's worth $1 gazillion. He rides around in limousines and trains $1 million racehorses. I'm some vagrant from the sticks who doesn't know a salad fork from a shrimp skewer.
Slowly, Greg shook his head.
Do you really think he cares about that? His family does. His family is not him.
Maggie's gaze fell to the carpet as the drying continued.
He really is worried about you.
Panic seized her.
You won't tell him where I am, will you?
It took a minute, but Greg finally shook his head. No, not if you don't want me to. Chapter 27. Keith went to church on Sunday, but it didn't feel right without her there. Afterward, he went to the gravesite and put a dozen daisies in the little flower holder. They were his mom's favorites. Then he went home and buried himself in the Bible and prayed for 2 more hours. Finally, when he could take the quiet no longer, he got in his truck and headed out for the falls. Under the tree, his mind traced back to that last magical moment with Maggie, holding her hand and gazing into her eyes. If only it could have been different. If only he could have done what he so wanted to do and taken her in his arms. What her lips must feel like. What she must feel like. As he let his thoughts float, other thoughts, darker ones, overtook him. She would never forgive him if she knew what his father had done to her family. He couldn't bring himself to forgive. How could she? You have to let people be on their own journey to find out what's important in their own time. His mother's voice, soft and graciousness, drifted through him, and he let his head fall back on the scratchy bark. Mercy is shown to those who show mercy. Mercy. Keith breathed that word through the hard rock at the top of his chest. Mercy to a man who had dragged him and so many others through a hell they didn't deserve. Mercy to one who bought and sold people's loyalty like it was on an auction block. Mercy to the man who had taken life itself as if he was God. How could he ever show his father mercy? Because he is where you are. Keith spoke the words as if he knew them for himself. Out loud, in his own voice, there was no denying it. His father was empty, lonely, sad, and hurting. He closed his eyes and shook his head. God, help me. He needs you more than he knows, but I don't even know enough to help him find you. Softly, the answer came. Trust and walk through the doors I open. Maggie walked to the nearest church on Monday. It was locked, so she sat on the steps and prayed as the morning rush passed by. How long she sat there, she wasn't sure, but she prayed in depth for everyone she could think of. When her mind wound round to Peter and Izzy, her heart twisted in on itself. It was pure selfishness to leave them like she had. That hurt to acknowledge, but it was true. She prayed that God would be with them even when she couldn't. Then her mind traced to Keith. God, please be with him. Help him find what he needs the most. Dad, can I talk to you? Keith pushed the door to his father's office open and found him not at his desk, but standing at the window, staring out into the yard beyond as the wedding scene was dismantled before him. Dad? His father glanced over his shoulder, but his gaze went immediately back to the window. I didn't mean for it to happen, you know. Any of it. I really wanted you and Dallas to be happy, just like your mother and I were. Slowly, carefully, Keith joined his father at the window. "Will you tell me about it? The accident, I mean." The pause stretched between them, widening with each passing second. "I'd been to a conference all week. Bonnie didn't want to come, but they were having a big party on Saturday night, and I talked her into coming anyway. I told her it was important for my work. She didn't want to. She wanted to stay with you. It was I don't know, something at school." The Star Parade. Keith hadn't thought of that in years, but he remembered how disappointed he was that not even his mom was there. Thinking back now, he didn't really remember who had taken him, just that he was on stage with no one who loved him in the audience. "She thought it was important. I told her there would be others. Besides, she didn't have to go to every single one. Of course, she didn't like that much. You know your mom." That didn't surprise Keith. She was always there. Always, even if his dad wasn't. The tone in his father's voice grew more somber. "I'd been drinking at the party. I always drank at parties back then. It was what you did. It was what everyone did. But then we left, and I took a wrong turn. Bonnie kept telling me I was going the wrong direction and to turn around. She was all panicked and telling me we would never find our way back because it was dark and we had no idea where we were. But I thought I knew best. I always knew best, and I was going to show her I didn't need her help or anybody else's." In Keith's mind, the car careened through the darkness, barreling down on the stop sign Keith knew was at the end of that road. He braced himself for the impact as if he was there. "They said there was a stop sign. I guess there was. I never saw it." A pause slid through the story. "The next thing I remember is holding Bonnie. There was blood everywhere, and lights and people. I don't know where they all came from. They were telling me I had to let her go, that they'd take care of her. But I knew even then she was gone." The other car, twisted and gnarled, crept into Keith's consciousness. What about the others? That brought his father's memories to a halt. Others? In the other car. The pause lasted much longer than Keith had expected. "How did you know about that?" "James and Christina Montgomery." Keith let the names seep into the dismal air between them. Maggie's parents. Everything stopped, and then his father turned to him almost without moving. "Maggie? Are you sure?" "May 7th. They were going to pick her up." "But how long have you known?" "Couple of weeks." "And you didn't say anything?" "I didn't know how." "Does Maggie know?" "No, and now she's gone." Keith let that go through him, and it unleashed the pain in every cell it met. He pushed it back, knowing that even the hurt wouldn't bring her back. "It's probably for the best. She deserved better than me anyway." His father's gaze drifted over to him. "I don't know about that. I think you'd be as good for her as she is for you." Incomprehension smashed through Keith, and his gaze went to his father's. "What does that mean?" The older man's gaze went back to the yard. "It means I'm proud of you." The word cracked over him. "Proud? Of me? Why?" "Because you know who you are. You know what you want. Heck, you stood up to Lee Farrell, who's eaten my lunch more than once." His father's smile was filled with sadness. "You are who I always wanted to be." Keith wasn't following. He kept hitting brick walls of how he'd always thought things were. "But you always wanted me to be you." The laugh was barely there. "That was the problem. You were me. The drinking, the partying, the living on the edge. I was never really sure you weren't going to blunder it all just like I did, until..." "Until?" His smile was thoughtful. You hadn't been to church since she died, had you? Keith's gaze fled out the window to the relative safety it provided. No, had you? Soft enveloped the answer. I couldn't face him with what I had done to her, and to you. So many days Keith had spent believing his father hated him, when in fact he loved him too much to trust himself to do it right. Well, maybe we could go sometime, you and me. There was surprise in the glance. You think they wouldn't throw me out? Hey, they didn't throw me out. They stood like that then, father and son, looking out on a world they had created as it was dismantled. Have you talked to Maggie? The thought knifed through Keith. I don't even know where she is. I called her foster mom, but she hasn't heard from her since she left for here. I called Greg. He doesn't know where she is either. His father thought for a long moment. I'm sorry to hear that, for you and for the kids. The kids. The pain ached deeper. He'd messed things up for them, too. Who's with them? The little girl who had them at the wedding. Jamie? Is that her name? Keith nodded. It was crazy how badly he missed them. Do you mind if I go see them? Just to say hi? Well, I'm sure they would love it. So, we're good? Keith held out his hand. With a nod, his father shook his hand. Yes, we're good. When Keith got to the kids' door upstairs, he had to steel himself to face the scene on the other side. He knew even before he got there that seeing them without Maggie would be visual verification of just how stupid he had been. He pushed the door open, and Isabella was the first one to see him.
Keith!
She scrambled to her feet and toddled over to him with her arms out the whole way. He dropped to his knees and wrapped her into himself. Hey, baby girl. He stood with her in his arms, and on the other side of the room, Jamie stood as well. She pulled her jersey down over her jeans nervously. Hi, Mr. Ayer. Have you heard from Maggie? Keith put his nose into Isabella's hair and breathed in the baby smell. No, unfortunately not. I'm sorry. He tried to smile, but it hurt. Peter walked to Keith, rubbing his eyes.
Where's Maggie?
He knelt and put his arm around Peter. Well, buddy, I'm not real sure.
Is she coming back?
Keith looked at Jamie. I don't know.
But I need her to come pray with me. I don't know how.
As much as he wanted to, he didn't have a good answer for that. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll come up and pray with you later, if you want me to. Peter looked unsure.
Really?
Really. Sunday night, true to his word, Keith knelt beside Peter's bed. He had told Jamie he would put the child to bed, so she had left them alone. He took Peter's hand, and the large eyes stared at him, afraid but trusting. Dear Lord, we know that you know things we can't, so we're going to trust that you have a plan all worked out for this. But Lord, we're really worried about Maggie. We don't know where she is or how she is, so please, if there is a way, bring her back to us because we need her, Lord. We really do. Please bless everyone that we love and hold them in your hands tonight. The prayer stopped, and he looked down at Peter.
What about the boys and girls part?
Peter asked. Fear nudged into Keith. I don't know that part. So Peter took over.
Please be with all the boys and girls in the world who are hurting or alone. Let them know that you love them as much as you love us. Amen.
Amen, Keith echoed. He stood and reached down with his fingers to touch the boy. Good night, Slugger.
Night, Keith. Thanks.
And Peter rolled over and closed his eyes. Monday morning, Keith was saying prayer after prayer as he drove to the stables. There was no telling what havoc his impromptu decision on Saturday had unleashed. Worse, he wasn't even sure he still had a job. After all, it was now June 5th, and he was supposed to have left for good on the 3rd. His only defense was to act like nothing had happened and hope for the best. In the stables, he grabbed the hay and started his morning chores. "No," Tanner said, coming out of the office. "I just checked, and it's only half of what we ordered." "I do not believe this." But the sentence trailed off when Ike joined Tanner in staring at the cowboy currently feeding the horses. "Keith, when did you get here?" "Just made it." He threw the hay to Buck and rubbed the horse's soft cream head. "I thought I'd check into getting some new tires for the trailers today. Those ones you're running are death traps." Ike looked at Tanner, who caught the message to give them some time. "I'll just be checking the water by the track," Tanner said, and Ike nodded. Keith continued to throw hay, liking how it felt to do physical labor again. 2 stalls, and then 3, and he was even with where Ike was standing. "So, is that it then?" Ike asked, putting his hands on his waist over the brown belt. "You're just going to pick up where you left off like nothing happened." Another 2 slabs of hay, and Keith wiped off his hands. "You got a better idea?" "Well, 1. You might tell me what happened, why you went off the deep end like that." "I just came to my senses, that's all." "Yeah? Well, it looked to me like you lost your mind, again." Peace overtook Keith. It must have been hard all those years trying to keep me in line. Slowly he began to see the past as it really was. Keith making stupid decisions, and Ike trying desperately to keep them from killing him. Keith shook his head. "I know you've put yourself on the line for me more than once, and I know there are things you didn't tell my dad, so he wouldn't know how lost I really was. I get that now. But I'm not a little kid anymore, Ike. I need to make some decisions for myself." Ike snorted. "I've seen how you make decisions, and that doesn't inspire confidence." "That's because I was the one making the decisions back then. I'm not anymore." The leather-tanned face fell in incomprehension, and Keith laughed. "Trust me, I know. I've made more rotten decisions than a guy should get to make in 10 lifetimes. But I'm not that guy anymore. I don't need the dumb decisions to fill the hole." "Hole?" Ike's expression was getting more worried by the second. "I don't—" Keith shook his head. "It's something I'm learning, about filling the emptiness with the one it was meant to be filled by." "And who's that?" "God." It seemed so very simple, but it had been so very hard to find. "God? I didn't know you were religious." Keith laughed. "Neither did I." His mind traced back. "Years ago, when Mom was here, we went to church a lot. Not that I ever really liked it much back then. But I see now the stuff she was trying to teach me, the stuff she knew I needed for when things got rocky. Unfortunately, I was a little too pig-headed to understand the gift she was giving me at the time, and when things got rough, it never occurred to me that God could help." "And now you do?" The question was skeptical in every syllable. "Yeah, I see now that God was with me every step, even when I was being a complete idiot about everything. He was leading me here, letting me see that none of those things would ever bring me real happiness. I get that now, and to tell you the truth, I can't wait to see where we're going next." "And your dad?" A smile touched Keith's heart. "We're learning. We see the mistakes we've made, and we're learning to forgive ourselves and each other." Ike didn't look wholly convinced. "What about Maggie? I'm sure she was thrilled when you told her the thing with Dallas fell through." That sent Keith's gaze crashing to the boards at his feet in a hail of hurt. "She left. I don't know where she is." "Well, I can't say that I'm surprised. Why would she be any different than all the rest of them?
It wasn't anger so much as a need to get Ike to understand that went through Keith.
That's just it. She was way different than the others. Maggie let me be me. She wasn't impressed with the money or the cars. She could have cared less about a fancy house or a job with the right company. She had peace, and considering what she had been through, that was saying a lot. What had she been through? What does that mean?
The questions were harsh and full of judgment and condemnation. However, there was no reason to keep it a secret any longer. It had been hidden far too long.
The wreck my dad had, the one that killed Mom, Maggie's parents were in the other car. They were killed instantly.
Ike's arms unwound as he stared in disbelief.
What? Keith, are you sure?
I read the newspaper articles myself, all of them. Keith exhaled the long night spent reading.
She grew up in the foster system because of that night and my dad's stupid decisions.
Then Keith knew he had to say it, but he wasn't sure he could. He took a deep breath to settle the words.
That's why I need to say thanks, Ike. Thanks for every lecture you ever gave me about drinking and driving. Thanks for every time you came and got me when I was stoned out in some corner. Thanks for every second you spent worrying about me and trying to make sure I didn't end up like him. I know it wasn't easy, and I didn't make it any easier. But I also know without you, I'd probably be rotting away in some jail cell somewhere, or dead. So, thanks.
Ike scratched his sideburn.
You know, if I didn't know better, I'd think you've gone and grown up on me.
Keith smiled.
Hey, it had to happen sooner or later.
Just after Keith got home from praying with Peter the next night, his cell phone beeped. His pulse leaped into his ears when he caught sight of the ID number. He clicked it on.
Have you heard from her?
Well, hello to you too, Greg said. No more news.
Crud, I was really hoping she'd called you.
We were just friends. I'd think she'd call you before she called me. Greg didn't sound exactly jovial. Listen, I called to tell you I've still got your rings from Saturday. The rings. Keith hadn't even thought of them, and they were the last thing he cared to think about now.
Can't you just put them in the mail to me?
The mail? They're megabucks rings, Keith. You really want me to mail them to you? Truth was, he didn't want them at all.
Well, then maybe you can bring them over some night.
No, I don't think so. I'm really swamped right now. I was wondering if you could come get them, though. I don't want the responsibility. You know where the key is, right?
Same place as always.
Yep, it's still there. Anyway, I'll leave them on the kitchen cabinet if you want to swing by sometime and get them.
Oh, okay.
The thought was less than appealing.
I'll try.
Chapter 28.
Are you sure you don't want to come with us?
Keith's father asked Vivian, who stood, glaring at them from the staircase. To church? Why would I want to go to church? Peter, who stood with his hand in his father's, looked up at her.
Because Jesus loves you, and he wants you to come see him.
Keith could have kissed the child, but instead he let his gaze trail up to Vivian, who looked positively dumbfounded. Oh, She couldn't get a full thought out.
You're welcome to come with us,
his father said, and Keith could hardly contain the hope.
But you don't have to if you don't want to.
Well, I guess I'm not doing anything else. She looked down at her outfit. I should go change.
You look beautiful. His father held his hand out to her. Come on, come with us. We want you to go.
The only person missing was Maggie, but for her, the family picture would have been complete.
Keith let Vivian hold Isabella, although in truth that made his arms feel awfully empty. He said a silent prayer for Maggie's safety, and then sat to listen to the sermon. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," the preacher intoned. "I shall not want." We say them, but do we ever really hear those words? They imply something our society doesn't understand, something we don't really believe. Because if we did, it would change everything about how we live. The fact is that when you put your life in God's hands, you don't have to want anything anymore, because you already have everything that you really need. I shall not want. Samuel 1 tells us that the Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. That means God isn't impressed with your cars, your house, or your bank account. He's impressed only with what's in your heart. In fact, in a very real way, your stuff only serves to chain you to the world, a world that will tell you that you must want everything, that you can only be happy if you get this toy or that thing. If we let it, the world will convince us to look to others for their acceptance and approval, for them to tell us how we're doing. But God doesn't work like that. God looks only at what's real, and the only thing that's real is the love in your heart. Everything else means nothing. The great and terrifying secret of the world is that you can work your whole life to accumulate things, pushing what is really important to the side, only to realize at the end that you missed the only thing God will ever care about when He looks at us. There is only one thing we can take with us from this life to the next, only one thing that will define us as we stand before the seat of judgment. It isn't our money or our stuff. It is the love we have given away. He stopped to let that sink all the way in. All we take with us, all we will have to show for this life when we stand before the throne of the Most High God, is the love we have given away, not the love we have attained, not the respect we have gained, not even the good works we have done to gain the applause of those around us, but only the love we have given away. That love can and should be manifested to the world at large, but it starts when it takes root deep in each and every heart. Then it grows outward from there, touching lives, changing hearts. It holds out forgiveness to those downtrodden by sin. It heals, it helps, it loves at all times, in all ways. Let that kind of love take root in you today. Let it permeate your life so that your every act is born out of it. Because when you root yourself in the love of God, you already have everything you will ever need, and heaven itself is within your grasp. Not someday, but right now, this very minute. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He paused. Let us stand. Keith stood as the unbelievable peace of God's love flowed around him. Love, he thought, and life will take care of itself. As scary as that sounded, he was ready to take the step from the world's way of doing things into God's. Okay, God, you got it. My life is yours. Take me where we're going. Would you like to join us tonight for dinner? His father said as they stood in the bright sunlight outside the church. Dinner? Keith asked in shock. Tonight? There was mist in his father's eyes, and he looked older and much more fragile than Keith remembered. We'd love to have you. For some inexplicable reason, he wanted nothing more than to hug the old man. I'd love to, Dad. And with that, he walked through the door God had opened between them as he stepped forward and wrapped his father in his arms. They had missed so much time in the hurt and anger, but Keith was determined from this moment forward they would be defined by the love between them rather than the animosity. He backed up and the tears in his father's eyes shimmered. Keith nodded. I have a couple errands to run first, and I'll be there. What, about 5:30? Whatever time you get there, you will have a place. It was time to start looking for a new job and a new life. Maggie was grateful for Greg's generosity the past week, but she couldn't live here forever. First and last month's rent, a car that ran, even money for groceries. She was at the bottom of the bottom again, and how she would ever get up from here, she had no idea. God, please, you're going to have to do this one because I sure can't. As she sat down on Greg's couch, she shook her head at the irony. She didn't even have a reference from her last job. She laughed at the thought of calling them. Yes, I realize I messed up your son's life forever. Could you tell them I'm punctual? If it wasn't so funny, she would have cried. She had just slid to the floor with the classifieds and a red pen when the doorknob jiggled. Her attention snapped to it, and instantly fear traipsed through her. Greg wasn't supposed to be back until later tonight. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed the vase from the end table, and took a step toward the door. The door opened, and a man stepped in, his head down as he worked the key back out of the lock. It was only when he looked up and came to full height that she realized who was standing there. The second Keith caught the unbelievable image of Maggie standing there with a vase poised to strike, his heart slammed forward. Maggie, what?
Keith?
She sounded almost as surprised as he was.
What are you doing here?
Me? What are you doing here?
I'm...
The vase lowered and then clattered to the glass table. She pulled her white tank top down around her old tan pants.
Greg didn't tell me you were coming.
Yeah, Greg didn't tell me a lot of things. Well, he didn't tell me you were here either. She anchored her arms across her middle as her gaze fell.
I told him not to.
You? He could hardly make it all the way through the questions jamming his head. What? Why?
Because...
She turned for the window on the other side of the room, leaving Keith to close the door so the whole world wouldn't hear. He slid it closed and stepped into the room behind her.
I didn't want to mess things up for you.
Her words sounded like she was being strangled.
I'm really sorry about Saturday.
He watched her for a second, standing there, apologizing. I'm not. She glanced back at him, and he heard the sniff. That wasn't your fault, Maggie. Look, Dallas and I were a disaster waiting to happen.
But you loved her. You were going to get married.
And when she turned, there were, in fact, tears coursing down her cheeks. His heart fell at the sight. Her idea of love and my idea of love were two different things. We just waited a little long to figure that out. Keith couldn't bear even the sight of Maggie in tears, so he stepped over to her and put his arms around her. I'm so sorry I hurt you. You'll never know how sorry I am for that. Maggie couldn't take how nice he was being, especially after everything she had done. She didn't want them to be, but Ike's words were never far away from her consciousness when she was with Keith. Even if Dallas was no longer in the picture, that didn't mean she had any better chance with him. She wasn't good enough for Keith Ayer, and she never would be. Pulling herself from his embrace, she stepped in the direction she least wanted to go, away from him.
Well, I'm sure your family was glad to be rid of me.
Rid of you? His face fell in concern as he stood watching her go. Are you kidding me? They're as worried about you as I am. In fact, Peter and I have been praying every night that you were safe and that we'd find you again. The pull of the words turned her to him.
You've been praying?
He laughed. That's about all I've been doing. Man, Maggie, it's been so incredible. Dad and Vivian went with me and the kids to church today. Incredulousness dropped across her face. To church? What did you do? Hog-tie them and drag them there? No, they came because they wanted to. He let out a breath, walked to the couch, and sat down. It's been so long since Dad and I have really connected. Maybe for forever. But he's coming around. He even put Pete on his lap at church today. Maggie had to sit down before she collapsed from the shock. She went to the couch as well, but made sure to put plenty of distance between them when she sat. Your dad? Yeah. Keith looked over at her, and there was an almost smile on his lips. Who would have believed that? What in the world? Did he get a brain transplant or something? More like a heart transplant. Keith's gaze plummeted to his hands, and the laughter fell away from him. A moment, and then another, and Maggie began to realize something wasn't right. Keith, what is it? What's wrong? He glanced at her, took a breath, and closed his eyes to gather his courage. She didn't like anything about how long it was taking him to tell her. Finally, he turned his full gaze on her. Look, Maggie, I have to tell you something that... He closed his eyes again and shook his head. The battle to get the words out was clear. When he looked at her again, his eyes pleaded with her to not trash everything over what he was about to say. After a moment, he turned and took her hands in his, holding them gently as the storm gathered in his eyes. Maggie, I don't know how to tell you this, so I'm just going to say it. He let out a long breath. My dad was the one, in the wreck, with your parents. She was having trouble getting everything her senses were telling her in. It was too much, and in the overwhelm she wasn't understanding what he was telling her. What do you mean, the one? Keith took another breath to settle the words. My dad. He was the one driving the other car. He killed your parents. My... what? Without really realizing it, Maggie pulled her hands from his, stood, and walked to the window. Words and memories swam in front of her eyes. It was too big of a coincidence, Keith said, following her with his words only. When I found out that they were in Midland when Mom was killed, I had to know. Maggie absorbed that, and then turned slowly, only able to concentrate on one thing at a time. And he told you? I looked it up first. He didn't have much choice after that. Keith let his gaze fall to his empty hands. I'm really sorry, Maggie. If I could bring them back, I would. In fistfuls, the pieces snapped into place in her heart. That's when your mom died. Pain etched across his face as he nodded. Yeah, I didn't know. I didn't even know Dad was with her until the other day. They never told me. For as bad as this was, when Maggie looked at him, she couldn't leave him alone in his grief. She stepped over to the couch, sat down carefully, and reached one hand over to his shoulder. I'm so sorry, Keith, for your loss, for everything. I hate this. I hate what it did to you. Her gaze dropped as the words brushed her heart. I'm okay. I've learned to forgive and to love in ways I might never have if it hadn't happened. He nodded, and then anguish washed through his eyes as his gaze found hers. I spent so many nights being mad at her for leaving, mad at God for taking her. And now I realize how much time I wasted wallowing in all of that. It wasn't wasted, Maggie said softly. It led you here. It made you who you are today, and who you are today is someone that I'm very glad to call my friend. Questioning misery went through his eyes. Friends? Is that what we are? The questions pushed her backward. I don't know. Isn't that what you want us to be? Answer upon answer went through his eyes. Finally, he shook his head. No, I can't just be friends with you. He exhaled, and her heart plummeted. However, when his gaze grabbed hers, there was a glimmer of peace and hope. "The truth is, I have fallen in love with you, Maggie. I think about you every second. I count the minutes until we can be together again. When I thought I'd lost you, it was killing me to think I'd never see you again. I know this is sudden, and I know it makes no sense, but I love you, Maggie. I do. I have ever since you fell down those stupid stairs." Joy, happiness, and disbelief danced through her. "And I've loved you ever since you wouldn't let me carry my own suitcase. I thought you were completely crazy." "I was, about you." Levity dissipated as his eyes grew serious, and then, as if life itself had never stood in their way, he leaned toward her and tilted his head so that his lips met hers in a burst of light and awe. One kiss, and he slid closer to her so his arms could gather her into them. Maggie felt weightless, taken up by his kisses and the feel of the strength of his arms around her. How many nights she had dreamt of this, and how many moments had she told herself it would never happen. And now, suddenly, beyond anything she could even have let herself wish, she was here with him, and it was better even than she had let herself ever believe it could be. Breathless from the kiss, she let his strength hold her as he backed away. Her eyes slid open, still lost in the dream. "And now I have to ask you something that you're probably going to run screaming from the hills when I say," Keith said, but he never let her go. "My parents are having dinner tonight, and I've been invited." His gaze drilled into her spirit. "Will you come with me?" Surprise jumped through her. "To dinner with your parents?" He nodded. No invitation to meet the parents had ever carried the weight that one did. She sat up, took a breath, and looked down at herself. Her hand went to her hair, and she knew she must look a mess. "I don't have anything to wear." Keith laughed. "Then what do you say we go do a little shopping?" Hand in hand, they walked up the steps to Greg's apartment. The 3 mall bags in Keith's other hand dangled there as if they belonged nowhere else. At the top of the stairs, he opened the door for her. "Why don't you go get ready, get your other stuff, and we'll take off." "Okay." She took the bags from him with a shy smile. He watched her walk down the hallway, and the truth was, he would be happy to watch that walk forever. He had waited only a few minutes next to the couch when noise at the door drew his attention there. A second, and he was standing face to face with the best friend a guy could ever have. "Keith," Greg said in surprise. His gaze slid down the hallway. "Hey, man, what's up?" "What's up? Yeah. You say that like you don't know." Fear traced across Greg's face. Keith laughed. "Well, I came by to get the rings, which, to be honest, I didn't even really care about. But it's the funniest thing. You never told me you got a new roommate." Greg ducked his head and stepped past Keith to the kitchen. He grabbed a glass from the cabinet and filled it with water before he faced Keith. "She didn't want me to tell you." Keith smiled. "You didn't." "Hi, everyone," Keith said, stepping into the dining room. Maggie was behind him, her hand firmly held by his so she couldn't run. "I brought you a surprise." Around the table, all gazes came up to him. He pulled Maggie around him, and questions turned to chaos.
"Maggie!"
Peter exclaimed, jumping from his chair and running to her. She caught him in a hug that brought tears to Keith's eyes.
"Kiki! Kiki! Kiki!"
Isabella yelled, bouncing in her high chair until it practically tipped over. "Hang on," Keith laughed as he tried to free the excited, kicking little girl. "You're stuck." His fingers worked the lever. "There we go."
He lifted her out, stood her on the floor, and she toddled to Maggie and Peter, who were having a tear-filled reunion on the floor of the dining room.
"Come here, you," Maggie said as she gathered Isabella in too. "Oh, I missed you so much, baby girl."
She kissed the little girl soundly on the top of the head as she gathered her into her embrace. Keith's gaze went from her to the head of the table, and he snagged his father's attention. Keith nodded in answer to the question in his father's eyes. It was all right. His father just didn't know it yet.
"Oh, Maggie,"
Inez said, nearly tripping over her when she came in with dinner.
"What are you doing here?"
Happiness radiated from Maggie's face.
"I couldn't stay away."
Dinner was wonderful. It was almost like being a part of a real family, Maggie thought. The kids were so happy. It was hard not to be, but then there were the times she chanced to glance at Mr. Ayer, and she knew this was anything but easy for him. When dinner was over, Maggie was less than sure what came next. Was she here as a nanny again? Or as Keith's date? And where did one end and the other begin? "Keith," Mr. Ayer said as they exited the dining room, "I'd like to talk to Ms. Montgomery, Maggie, for a minute, if you don't mind. Can you handle the kids?" "Handle them?" Keith asked wickedly. "I'll handle them all right." He swung Peter up and over his shoulder. Then he reached down and took Isabella's hand. Bouncing so that Peter made sounds, Keith climbed the stairs. At the bend, he stopped and looked right at Maggie. "We'll be up here when you're finished." "Okay," she said, wondering how she even got those 2 syllables out. "Come with me," Mr. Ayer said. Maggie swallowed half of her trepidation, leaving the other half to suffocate whatever confidence she had managed to acquire during the meal. She followed the man who held her future in his hands all the way to his office. If this could have been any more nerve-wracking, she wouldn't have known how. Instead of sitting at the desk as she had expected him to, Mr. Ayer went all the way to the huge window behind it. He stood there, hands clasped behind his back, staring out into the twilight beyond for the longest minute of her life. By the time he started talking, she wasn't even breathing anymore. "You know, Miss Montgomery, I had pretty much given up on what I always thought were my dreams ever making me happy. I had managed to acquire everything I'd ever wanted: money, fame, prestige, a family, this house and estate. I had businesses and clients and employees, but I knew something was missing." He glanced back at her. "A long time ago, I made a huge mistake. One I have never forgotten about, even for a single second. I knew it at the time, but I thought if I just covered it up good enough, no one would ever see me for what I knew I really was. So, instead of going away, it festered, and the harder I tried to pretend it wasn't there, the worse it got. That night, all my behavior before it and after it just dug me in deeper and deeper until I didn't think there was any way back out. And then you came along." The words pushed Maggie backward. "Me, sir?" He smiled at her sadly. "I didn't just lose my wife the night you lost your parents. I lost my son and myself. I lost what it was to be happy, to love someone else." He exhaled. "Keith took the brunt of my stupidity, as I'm sure you well know, but I'm afraid it wasn't just him who suffered. I believe you did as well." Maggie tried to wave it off. "No, Miss Montgomery, you have shown grace and courage in the face of great difficulty. I find that awe-inspiring. You have held your own in this house, and let me just say, I know that hasn't been easy." With that, he faced her. "I guess what I'm trying to say is that you, my dear, are my role model. I cannot tell you how impressed I have been with how you have guided Keith to something better than he ever was before. It reminds me very much of another young lady, much like yourself, who tried to get a headstrong young businessman to see how badly he was missing what's really important. I wasn't trying. No, you didn't have to try, because that's who you were. That's who you are. He smiled. I want my children to learn from that. In fact, I want to learn that as well.
Sir?
He stopped her with a raise of his hand. Now, I want it made perfectly clear that when Keith asks you to marry him— Maggie's eyes went wide as her heart jerked forward, but he stopped her before she could protest. Which he will. However, I do not want Peter and Isabella to grow up without your influence. I know, after my track record, and I have no right to demand anything. So, I'm asking you. Will you stay and teach my children what I cannot?
For as irrational as that sounded, Maggie's heart went out to him. His humility in the face of everything that had happened overwhelmed the last traces of her anger toward him. She stepped around the desk and over to him. The hesitation lasted only a second before she put her arms around him. At first he was taken aback by her actions, but then he let her hug truly embrace him. Gently he patted her arm without returning the gesture. When she backed up, she looked at him squarely. And just so you never have to wonder, I forgive you. God and I hashed that out a long time ago. I know you didn't mean to hurt them.
Oh, I didn't. I really didn't. If I could go back—
No, she said, stopping him firmly. We can't go back, but we can go forward. His smile was slow and hopeful.
I'd like that.
Are they asleep? Maggie asked as she treaded down the hallway, lit only by the glow of the nightlight. She felt like she'd missed so many nights with them already.
They're down, Keith said as he closed Isabella's door. But I think Peter's waiting for his angel to come and pray with him.
Maggie's heart cracked open as joy surged through her. She stepped past Keith, then turned. You coming?
He put his hand over hers. I wouldn't miss it.
She pushed into the room, and Peter looked over at her.
Maggie!
She put her finger to her lips, although she really wasn't mad. Is he sleeping? Softly she crept over to the bed, and she was momentarily sad when Keith dropped her hand. However, in seconds, he was on the other side of the bed, reaching out for her once again, and something in her sensed how his spirit had been doing that to hers from the very beginning. With no reservation, she laid her hand in his and bent her head. Dear Heavenly Father. She had to shake her hair back away from her face at the amazement of it all. Thank you so very much. Every good thing comes from you, and we thank you for all the blessings you have given us, for Peter and Isabella, for the Ayers, and Inez and Patty Ann, Tanner, Jamie, and Ike. We thank you, Father, for all of them. Thank you for keeping them safe for us. We ask that you keep those who you have already drawn back to yourself in your loving embrace until we can see them again. Most of all, God, we thank you for the gift of love. She squeezed Keith's hand, lest he not understand the depths of her gratefulness. We know it is a gift from you, and we give thanks that you have chosen to share it with us. The prayer was winding to the end. We ask that you keep all the boys and girls in the world safe tonight. If they are lonely, give them comfort. If they are hungry, send someone to feed them. If they are in danger, protect them, O God. Keep us all safe in your love this night and every night. Amen. Her eyes stayed closed as she let the prayer and the peace settle into the deepest recesses of her being. And please, dear God, Keith said, startling Maggie out of her reverie.
let Maggie say yes. Her gaze slid to his in incomprehension. He smiled at her. Amen.
Amen,
Peter echoed, and Maggie could hardly get her gaze off of Keith long enough to remember Peter was still in the room. She pushed herself to her feet, wobbling on the weight she found standing. Her 2 fingers knew what to do, which was a lucky thing because no rational signals were getting from her brain to her body. She kissed them and pressed them softly to Peter's forehead. Good night, sweet prince. With that, she turned and headed for the door. Night, slugger. Her heart flipped over at how natural this all felt. In the hallway she waited for him, and she had to steal her breath when he joined her. Those arms, that presence. If anything, it had gotten stronger since they'd last stood here. When the door was closed, Keith turned to her. He narrowed his eyes at her and shook his head. Man, I hope God was listening. He stopped for only one moment, and then he knelt on a single knee. Maggie? Astonishment swept over her, and she put her hand to her mouth. Gently he reached up, took it from her mouth, and pulled it down to his. Maggie Montgomery, I don't ever want to spend another day away from you. Please make me the happiest man in the world. Say you'll marry me. Breath was her only answer for a long moment. Yes, I'll marry you. He stood, swept her into his arms, and kissed her like she had never been kissed before. Then, holding her in the safety of his embrace, he backed up and smiled at her. I'm sure glad God was listening. Epilogue. I thought you said you wanted a simple ceremony, Keith's father said as he picked his way down the rocky path. Haven't you ever heard of an aisle? It gets better over there, Keith said, pointing to the tree as he helped his dad and Vivian down the steep slope. However, even the happiness in him snagged when he caught sight of Maggie, standing with the children under the tree waiting for them. The falls beyond sang with the fresh rain that had fallen the night before. Washed clean, the scene was so perfect the fact that God had created it was the only logical conclusion anyone could have surmised. The ground leveled out, and Keith let them go to travel on their own. Oh, Conrad, this is beautiful, Vivian exclaimed. I didn't even know this was here. His father was equally stunned. I'd forgotten that it was. Stepping from their presence, Keith walked over to Maggie. With Peter and Isabella gazing up at them from her side, he put his arms around her. I didn't know it was possible to feel like this, he whispered to her. His smile shone from the depths of his heart as he took in the soft gaze, the gentle face, yes, even the new gold-toned glasses that he'd accepted so reluctantly. He loved them all because he loved her. You ready? She asked, gazing up at him. More than. Maggie's hand stayed in Keith's as they turned to the preacher. If there was an ounce more joy in her, she felt like she would burst right open. Keith and Maggie, have you come here freely and without reservation to declare your love before God and man? We have. Her voice mingled right into his, harmony personified. The preacher motioned for them to look at each other, and Maggie had the feeling that she was falling more in love with each passing second as he held her with his gaze. As the preacher said the words, Keith said them to her, and his voice blended with the melody of the falls. I, Keith, take you, Maggie, to be my lawful wedded wife. I promise to be true to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer. I will love you and honor you all the days of my life. Her smile drifted through her heart to her eyes and right to him. I, Maggie, take you, Keith, to be my lawful wedded husband. I promise to be true to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer. I will love you and honor you all the days of my life." "The rings, please." Keith let her hand go to reach into his pocket. He gave the rings to the preacher and took not a second more to have her hands in his once again. The preacher blessed the rings and gave Keith the simple gold band. "Maggie, take and wear my ring as a sign of my love and fidelity, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." Her hands were shaking so badly, Maggie was afraid she would drop his, but she managed to get it from the preacher's hand onto Keith's finger. However, even when it was on, the emotion gripped her, and she wasn't at all sure she could get the words out. However, she looked at him, and his smile flowed through her spirit. "Keith, take and wear my ring as a sign of my love and fidelity, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." She slid the ring to his knuckle, and he slid it all the way on without ever dropping her gaze from his. A breath, and his hands were once again supporting hers. "Now, by the powers vested in me by the state of Texas," the preacher said, "I now pronounce you man and wife. Keith, you may kiss your bride." Maggie's heart filled to overflowing as he took her in his arms and brushed his lips to hers. One kiss and then one more. He backed up and then with a laugh swept her up once more and kissed her soundly. One thing was for sure, being with him would never be boring. When he finally let her go enough to put air between them, wonder was in his eyes. "May I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Keith Ayer." With his arm securely around her, Keith hugged the moment to them. The others clapped, and then his father stepped up to them. "Maggie, Keith, I probably should wait until the reception later, but—" He looked out to the falls, and when he looked back to them, there were tears in his eyes. "I want you to know I have taken the liberty of setting up 2 foundations to be run by the 2 of you. One, run by Maggie for the benefit of the foster care system, is to be called the James and Christina Montgomery Foundation. It will be seeded with $10 million and will no doubt benefit many of the children Peter prays for every night." Speechless, Maggie looked at Keith, who was equally stunned. "And Keith," his father looked at him, "I do not know who you are meant to help in this world. So, I have left the exact mission of the Bonnie Ayer Foundation open-ended. I do know, however, that you will do the right thing with it." Tears flowed down the old man's cheeks as he pulled them into a hug. "God bless you both." "Keith!" The voice from the rocks crashed through the celebration. "Keith! Keith! Maggie!" Stumbling down the path came Jamie with Tanner right behind her. She had a cell phone up in the air. I know, but this call just came in, and I knew you would want to take it." Maggie's gaze went to Keith as he took the cell phone from Jamie. "Hello?" His gaze traced down to her. "Yes, this is Keith Ayer." The pause set her pulse racing as she tried to figure out what was going on. "Already?" He looked at her, and she read every word. Stunned disbelief smashed into her. "Already?" Yes, ma'am. We can be there tomorrow morning." "Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you, ma'am." He squeezed Maggie to him as he beeped the phone off. Love surged through her like a gigantic fountain. After a moment for just the 2 of them to enjoy the news, his gaze swept over the others and then down to Maggie in confirmation. "Well, we were going to wait to tell you this, but I guess it's kind of late now." Her gaze stayed on him as love so strong it swept the rest of the world from her gushed through her. "We applied to be foster parents, and, well," he looked down at her again. "They have a little girl they want to place with us in the morning." Ohs and gasps crisscrossed the little group. "It was a little unconventional," Keith said, gazing at Maggie, who was lost in his words and his eyes. "But they pulled some strings, and it's for real. Elisa Marie will be with us by tomorrow night." She let out a long breath as Keith turned to her once again and pulled her into his embrace. Never could Maggie have guessed she could feel for another person what she felt for him at that moment. They were together. They were a team, and deep in her heart, she knew this moment had been in God's plan from the very beginning. God had taken everything life had thrown at them and stitched something very, very good from it. She now had a husband and a family, and tomorrow she would be the bridge for a little girl to learn that even life's trials aren't the end of the story if you trust God to open the doors you were meant to walk through. Somehow, she had always known that to be true, and as Keith hugged her to him once again, any questions that had remained on that count faded away forever. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God. Ephesians 2:8.
Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.
This has been Deep in the Heart, written by Staci Stallings. Narrated by Becky Dowdy of Brave Hearts Audiobook Productions. Copyright 2010 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.